Okay, everybody, this is your asynchronous lesson walkthrough. So the first thing you'll need to do is open the module called Political Consequences of Expansion and open the slideshow that is there. It is the exact same slideshow that I'm going to be walking you through today. So on the first slide, you see that this lesson is asynchronous. You'll complete it on your own and then submit it. So we're going to go through each of the slides. We're going to follow the directions, and then we're going to turn it in when we're done. All right. So this is political consequences of expansion. So we're going to be looking at the benefits and kind of negatives of the United States expanding during the 1800s. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain those political consequences of both geographic expansion and gaining new territory, but also economic expansion of growing the economy to meet the new demands of all these new territories. All right, so Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to a man named John Holmes in 1820, said this: "But this momentous question, like a fireball in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union." Knell means kind of like the sound of the end of something. "It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. A geographical line will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper." So your question is this: what do you think Jefferson is talking about? Okay, so let's take this a little bit closer, line by line. So he's saying this momentous question, momentous means hugely important question, awakened him and filled him with terror. And he says this question, on the one hand, made him feel like the Union was going to end. And even though things are quiet right now, there's no open conflict, he thinks that this is just temporary, right? It's a reprieve only. This is just a temporary quiet. And then he says, a geographical line will never be obliterated. The word obliterated means like destroyed, erased, no longer in existence. So a geographical line, so a line on a map that marks territory, will never be destroyed or erased. Every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. What does that mean? Every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. So write what you think this means on your slide, and go ahead and pause this presentation while you do that. All right, so now that you've answered that question of what you think Jefferson was talking about, we're going to make sure that we understand the difference between free states and slave states. So free states are the states that didn't allow slavery, okay? And most of these states existed in the North, and they wanted to keep slavery contained within the states that already existed, okay? They didn't want it to expand to new territories or new states. Slave states are states where slavery was legal, and most of these states were in the South, and the people in the slave states wanted slavery to be able to expand and spread into the new territories because it would help the Southern economy, okay? So free states are ones where slavery is not allowed and they don't want it to spread to other states. Slave states are where slavery was legal and they wanted slavery to be able to expand into other territories. Okay, So the US Congress in 1819, this is how representation looked in Congress. So each state has 2 representatives. And so the free states had 22 senators, and the slave states had also had 22 senators. Get my little pointer. Okay. Now, the House of Representatives, which remember is based on population, okay, and we had the 3/5 compromise saying that, 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted towards population. So the free states had 105 representatives in the House, and the slave states had 81. Okay, so clearly the free states had more representation in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate, they were equal. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to answer the questions below in this chart using the previous chart that we just looked at and your background information. Okay, so we've got this chart here that we already looked at, and you're going to answer these questions. So go ahead and pause this recording. And when you've answered these questions on your slides, go ahead and unpause. All right, so now you're going to watch a short video. After you watch the video, you're going to read some details of the Missouri Compromise, and then you're going to answer this question below. All right, so you're going to click play. Okay, it will open a new window. It will probably make you log in. Okay, and you'll log in with your student credentials. All right, so you're going to watch this video, and then you're going to come back here. You're going to read over these details, and then you're going to answer the question, what might happen when the territories become divided into new states? Okay, and when you are done, go ahead and unpause this presentation and move on to the next slide. Okay, so take a look at this map, okay, and this shows you the proposed situation with the Missouri Compromise, okay? So this line right here, this red line, is the one they're talking about with the Missouri Compromise, that anything south of this line, would be considered okay for slavery. And then anything north would be no slavery allowed, okay? So this line here, even though Missouri is above it, they're saying Missouri can have slaves, and the things below, like the Arkansas territory, they'll be able to have slaves if they ever become a state. And in exchange, Maine will enter as a free state, and these territories up here, if they become states, they will also be free states. Okay, so we just talked about the Missouri Compromise and kind of the results of that. We're going to move on now, and we're going to start talking about President Andrew Jackson. And we've already discussed him briefly when we were talking about the Indian Removal Act and the impact of westward expansion on Native Americans. And so we're already familiar with kind of President Jackson and some of his presidential actions. Now, President Jackson had a different idea of what democracy was compared to some of the presidents that came before him. And this is called Jacksonian democracy. And this included expanding voting rights for white men, okay? Meaning that President Jackson wanted white men who didn't own property to be able to vote, Okay, before this, remember that you had to be a white male property owner in order to vote. He wanted to expand voting rights to even white men who didn't own property. He also wanted to change the spoil system, where presidents would appoint their friends, essentially, or their financial supporters to prominent government positions. He believed in a strong federal government, and then he also, as we know, sponsored the Indian Removal Act. Okay, so let's go into some more detail here. Originally, only white men who owned land and paid taxes could vote. Okay, during Jackson's time, he expanded it to what is called universal white male suffrage. All white men could vote, regardless of whether or not they owned property. In 1870, Black men got the vote when the 15th Amendment was passed. Okay, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920. However, even though the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, Southern states instituted what were called Black codes or Jim Crow laws, which continued to prevent African Americans, men and women, from voting. And it wasn't until the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, that these laws were repealed. But there are still controversies across the United States in regards to voting laws, because the voting laws are set by each state and not by the federal government. And so some of these laws do continue to negatively impact the rights of people of color to vote. In the 17 to 1800s, only 4 states allowed African American to vote without any kind of restrictions. In 1792 and 1838, 7 states specifically disenfranchised Black men, meaning specifically prevented Black men from voting, while at the same time they expanded the voting rights for white men. Rhode Island was the only state that expanded the right to vote for Black men during this time. New York had property requirements for Black men, but not for white men. So if you lived in New York and you were a white man, you could vote even if you didn't own any property. But if you were a Black man, you had to own property in order to vote. In 1855, only 100 African Americans out of 11,000 had enough property to vote in New York City. All right, so let's take a look at these charts. This chart shows us the change in the number of people eligible to vote in these different presidential election years. Okay, so take a look at how many votes were cast, and of those votes, you know, this is the percentage of eligible voters who actually voted. All right, so take a look at this, and in the box right here, what trend do you see in voter participation? So what trends do you see? Go ahead and write that down, pause this, and when you're ready to move on, unpause. Okay, so what you're going to do now is you're going to, in your module, you will see an answer key. You can open that up and check all of your answers from the previous slides, okay? Now, your answers may not be exactly worded like the ones in the answer key, but you're checking to see if you've got the general idea correct, okay? So you can go back through your slides and check them against the answer key, all right? The next thing you're going to do is you're going to check synergy. If you have anything in there that's a 50%, that means you did not do it, okay? So you need to go and do that, all right? You can look at your graded Q3 work module. If you're all caught up, the next thing you're going to do is there's an extension at the bottom of the answer key. Okay, so here's the answer key here. And at the bottom, okay, this extension right here, you're gonna take a look at this chart. Okay, and this chart is showing us what qualifications did people need in order to vote in each of these states? And then if they had any kind of qualification that was required, when did that requirement end? Okay, and then were there race or gender requirements? So for example, if we look at Connecticut, in between 1787 to 1860, if you lived in Connecticut, you had to own property, okay? And that was the law until 1818. Okay, in 1818, they canceled that requirement and they just had a tax requirement until 1845. In addition, you had to be a white male, okay? But then in 1818, when they got rid of the property tax, this allowed Black men, or the property requirement, this allowed Black men to vote, okay? So that's what you're gonna do if you've caught up on all your work, you're gonna answer these questions down here, and then you can turn this in when you're done as well. If you have any questions or you need help with any of this, you can always reach out to your social studies teacher and we will be happy to help you. Have a great day, guys. Maybe if I can figure out how to end. There we go. All right, bye for real.